Still unclaimed at 30? The Baroness giggled, fanning herself among her circle of fashionable friends, and there was a little ripple of obliging laughter at the expense of the quiet woman who was not there to defend herself. For it is one of the small cruelties of the world that a woman who has reached 30 unmarried may be laughed at by people not fit to mend her gloves, and thought to deserve it. The Baroness Frayne was very pleased with her joke. She had a daughter to dispose of that season, a pretty insipid girl named Lucinda, whom she meant for the greatest match in the county, and it amused her, while she waited for the Duke of Harcourt to come to the point with Lucinda, as she was sure he must. To make a little merry sport of the dull, dependable spinster, Margaret Ashby, who had nursed and reared a houseful of orphaned brothers and sisters through the years other women were dancing, and had emerged at 30 with nothing to show for it, in the Baroness's estimation, but a faded gown and an unclaimed hand. Poor Miss Ashby, the Baroness sighed. In the tone people use to enjoy another's misfortune, so very worthy and so very much upon the shelf. One does wonder what becomes of such women, and the circle tittered and agreed that it was a pity, and a little ridiculous, and exactly what a woman must expect who let her bloom go by in the sickroom and the nursery instead of the ballroom. What the Baroness did not know, what none of that giggling, fashionable circle knew, was that at the very hour she was making her joke, a great travelling carriage with a ducal crest upon its door stood waiting at the gate of Margaret Ashby's modest house, that the Duke of Harcourt himself, the very man the Baroness was keeping warm for her daughter, was at that moment within, sitting in Margaret's plain parlour with his hat in his hand, and that he had come, not on any errand of business or charity, but for the single purpose of beginning to court the unclaimed spinster at whom the whole county was permitted to laugh. The carriage was already at the gate, the joke was already hollow, and the Baroness Frayne, fanning herself and tittering in her drawing-room, was the last person in the county to learn that the woman she pitied was about to be lifted clean over her head, and that the laugh, when it came round at last, would not be hers. Margaret Ashby was 30 years old that spring, and if the world saw in her only a faded spinster on the shelf, that was the world's loss and its blindness. For there was more real worth in her quiet person than in a whole ballroom of the bright young creatures the world preferred. She had not always been alone, nor always overlooked. The eldest child of a gentleman of modest fortune and the warmest of hearts, she had grown up in a happy, crowded country household, the cherished daughter of parents who doted on her and the adored elder sister of a tribe of younger brothers and sisters. But when Margaret was barely 20, the year she ought by rights to have had her own season and her own suitors, a fever carried off both her parents within a single dreadful month, and left her at an age when other girls think of nothing but their next dance, the sole guardian and mainstay of 5 younger children, the eldest 14 and the youngest not yet 4. There had been very little money. There had been no one else. And Margaret Ashby, without a word of complaint and without an instant's hesitation, had quietly folded up her own youth and her own hopes and put them away in a drawer, and given herself, wholly and for 10 years, to the raising of her brothers and sisters. It had cost her everything the world counts. The years in which she might have married had gone, one after another, into school fees stretched out of a slender income, into nursing through every childish illness, into the 1,000 daily sacrifices of a girl playing mother to a houseful at an age when she should have been a girl still. Suitors there might have been, in the beginning, but a young man looking for a wife does not commonly want one with 5 children already on her hands, and Margaret, who would not abandon her charges for any offer, had let what chances came go by, and watched her bloom fade in service, and arrived at 30 with her brothers and sisters all grown and decently settled at last, and herself, by every reckoning the Baroness Frayne understood, left over. But she was not embittered, and she was not broken, and she did not pity herself, which the world found almost provoking. She had a serene good sense, a deep, unfailing kindness, a quiet wit, and a heart so unsoured by 10 years of self-denial that those few who troubled to know her loved her without quite knowing why. The world saw a spinster, dull and dependable and past her bloom. One man, who had eyes to see, saw a woman worth more than the whole fashionable county put together, and that was the difference between the Duke of Harcourt and everybody else. The 10 years Margaret gave to her brothers and sisters were the making of the woman the Duke fell in love with, and they ought to be understood. For the world that laughed at their result had no notion of the quiet heroism that produced it. She had been 19 and on the very edge of her own first season when the fever came. She remembered, ever after, the dizzying speed of it, the happy crowded house, the plans for her coming out, her mother's laughing talk of the suitors she would have, and then, in the space of 4 terrible weeks, both her parents dead, the house gone silent, and 5 frightened children looking to her and to no one else in the world to tell them what was to become of them. There had been an aunt who might have taken 1 or 2 of the children and parceled the rest among grudging relations. There had been well-meaning advice that Margaret should send the little ones away and secure her own future while she still had her bloom. She had refused it all without a second thought. They were her family. They had no one but her. And she would no more have broken them up and farmed them out than she would have cut off her own hand. So she had become, at 19, mother and father and household manager and teacher to 5 children, on an income that barely stretched to feed them. She had sat up through the measles and the croup and the long nights of childish terror, had let down her own gowns to clothe growing girls and gone without a new one herself for 10 years, had taught the boys their letters and the girls their music and all of them their prayers, had economized and contrived and gone short, and never once let any of them feel for an instant that they were a burden or that she regretted the youth she was spending on them. And one by one she had brought them up and seen them safely launched, the eldest boy into a respectable profession, the girls decently married, the youngest at last old enough to need her no more. It had taken everything she had, and all the years a woman is supposed to spend on herself, and at the end of it she was 30, and poor and unmarried, and the world pronounced her a failure. The world was a fool. She had succeeded at the hardest and most thankless task a young woman can be handed, and succeeded gloriously, and the patience, the strength, the unselfish steady love she had poured out for 10 years had not been wasted at all, but had made her, without her knowing it, into precisely the woman a wise man would cross a county to find. It is worth pausing on what the world's contempt actually felt like to a woman in Margaret's position, for the giggling of the Baroness Frayne was not a single cruelty, but the daily climate of her life, and the bearing of it was its own kind of courage. A single woman of 30 without fortune occupied, in that society, one of the loneliest and most slighted positions it had to offer. She was past the age when she might be courted, and so of no further interest to the young men. She was unmarried, and so faintly suspect, faintly pitiable in the eyes of the matrons she had no establishment of her own and no prospect of one. And so was forever a little dependent, a little in the way, the spinster relation or the worthy neighbor whom one invited out of duty and seated below the salt. She was expected to be grateful for small attentions, to make herself useful, to efface herself, and above all to bear with a good grace the endless small humiliations that the world heaped, half carelessly and half on purpose. Upon a woman it had decided was finished. Margaret had borne it all for years. She had been talked over as though she could not hear, pitied to her face, passed over at table and in conversation, and made the butt of exactly the kind of joke the Baroness had been enjoying, and she had borne it with a serene, unbroken dignity that never gave her tormentors the satisfaction of seeing her wince. But it would be wrong to think it did not hurt. It hurt a great deal. She was a woman of deep feeling under her composure, and every slight found its mark. and there had been nights, more than she would ever have confessed, when the loneliness and the sense of being counted worthless had pressed on her very hard indeed. What had saved her was the thing her 10 years of service had built in her, a settled inward knowledge of her own worth that did not depend on the world's opinion of it. She knew what she had done with her life. She knew the value of the love she had given and the duty she had kept. And somewhere beneath the reach of all the world's contempt, she held quietly to the conviction that she was a person of worth, whatever the Baroness Fraynes might giggle, and that a value earned in 10 years of faithfulness could not be giggled away by people who had never been faithful to anything in their lives. It was that unshaken inner certainty, worn smooth and strong by long use, that let her meet the world's slights with serenity, and it was that same quiet self-possession, so rare and so unconscious, that the Duke of Harcourt had seen across a crowded room and been unable to forget. The Duke of Harcourt, who had eyes to see, had come by his clear sight the hard way, for he was a man whom the world had been trying to marry for 20 years, and the long siege had taught him to tell true coin from false with a bitter exactness. Maximilian, Duke of Harcourt, was 38, and he was, by a wide margin, the greatest matrimonial prize in that part of England, master of a vast estate possessed of an ancient title. And still, when he troubled to be, a strikingly handsome man. He had been hunted accordingly. From the day he came into his honors, a green young man of 22, he had been the quarry of every matchmaking mother, and every ambitious girl in the kingdom had been flattered, angled for, waylaid, and schemed over without rest for 16 years. Had watched simpering misses affect a sudden passionate interest in subjects they cared nothing for. The moment they learned the extent of his rent roll, had seen the same bright practiced smiles turned on him by 100 young women who would have shuddered at him had he been a poor man. And the long experience had bred in him exactly what such an experience breeds in an intelligent man: a deep, cold, weary cynicism about women and the marriage market, and a settled conviction that no woman living was capable of regarding him, the man, with any feeling untainted by regard for the Duke the prize. He had armored himself in that cynicism, and it had made him formidable and cold. He had grown guarded, sardonic, and reserved, slow to show what he felt, and slower still to believe in the feeling of others. He held the whole simpering marriage market in a contempt he was at no great pains to hide, and had reached 38 unwed, because he would sooner remain so to the end of his days than be caught, like a prize fish, by one of the bright hooks forever trailed before him. It had made him lonely, though he would have denied it. A man who trusts no one's affection is as solitary in a crowded ballroom as on a desert island, and the Duke of Harcourt, behind his cold magnificence, was a deeply solitary man who had long since stopped expecting to be loved for anything but his coronet. And then, by the slow accident of living in the same county, he had begun to notice a woman who wanted nothing from him at all, who did not angle or simper or brighten artificially at his approach, who treated him, when their paths crossed, with a plain, serene courtesy that asked for nothing and offered no bait, and who was, the more he observed her, possessed of exactly the genuine worth, the sense, the goodness, and the quiet, unbought dignity that 16 years of fortune hunters had taught him to believe did not exist. Her name was Margaret Ashby. The world called her a spinster on the shelf. The Duke of Harcourt, watching her, had begun to think her the only real woman he had ever met. How the Duke first came to notice Margaret, out of all the women in the county, is a small story in itself, and it shows that he was drawn to her from the very first by precisely the qualities the world held against her. It had happened by degrees, over a year or more, in the ordinary course of country neighborhood. They were not of the same world. A duke and a portionless spinster do not move in the same circles, but a county is a small place, and their paths had crossed often enough. At the church, at the bedside of a sick cottager they both happened to be relieving, at the dull local gatherings a great landowner must sometimes attend. And the Duke, whose cold eye had learned to see through the practiced charms of 16 seasons, had found his attention caught again and again by the quiet woman whom everyone else overlooked. He had watched her with the sick and the poor and seen a kindness that was wholly unconscious of being observed. He had heard her speak, on the rare occasions anyone troubled to ask her opinion, and found a clear good sense entirely free of the simpering affectation he had come to expect from women. And he had noticed, with a growing fascination he did not at first understand, that she was the one woman in the county who never, by so much as a glance, tried to attract him. That was the thing that undid him, in the end, that she wanted nothing from him. Every other woman he met, and every mother of every other woman, treated him as a prize to be won, brightened when he approached, angled for his notice, made themselves agreeable with one eye always on his rank. Margaret Ashby treated him as a man. She was civil to him as she was civil to everyone. Neither more nor less, she did not flutter, or flatter, or contrive to be near him. She seemed, indeed, to have not the smallest expectation that the Duke of Harcourt could have any particular interest in a spinster of 30, and to be entirely at her ease with him precisely because she had written off any such possibility before it could occur. To her, and to a man sick to his soul of being hunted, that plain, unangling indifference was more attractive than all the practiced arts in England. He found himself seeking her out, found himself caring, absurdly, whether she thought well of him, found the dull gatherings he had always shunned suddenly worth attending if she would be there. He, who had spent 16 years being pursued, had finally met a woman worth pursuing, and the chase, for the first time in his life, was on the other foot, and he the eager party, and she serenely unaware that there was any chase at all. If you are sitting by your own fire tonight, with a lamp turned low and the day's cares set aside, then settle yourself in comfort. And let me tell you how a woman the whole county laughed at came to be valued above them all by the one man whose valuing was worth having, and how a great duke, who had grown too wise in the ways of fortune hunters to believe in love, was taught the truth of it by a faded spinster who had never once tried to catch him. For this is a story about seeing and not seeing, about the difference between what the world prizes and what is truly precious, about a woman whose worth had been spent so quietly in service and in sacrifice that the foolish world mistook the very proofs of her goodness for the marks of her failure. I shall tell you, before the candle gutters, where in the world I picture you listening. But first you must understand the cruel little world that laughed at Margaret Ashby, and the giggling baroness who led the laughter, so that you may relish the more the day it all came round. The Baroness Frayne is worth a fuller look. Not because she was important, but because she was so perfect a specimen of the kind of person whose good opinion the world chases and whose bad opinion is worth nothing at all. She was a handsome, idle, fashionable woman of middle age, the widow of a baron who had left her a comfortable jointure and a position in county society, both of which she valued above everything on earth. She had no occupation but pleasure, no measure of worth but rank and fashion, and no kindness in her that ever cost her anything. She was one of those women who are perfectly amiable to their equals and perfectly merciless to anyone they think beneath them, and who mistake their own cold heartlessness for elegance. Her chief business that season was the marrying of her daughter Lucinda, a pretty, vapid, well-dressed girl of 19 with her mother's hard eyes and none of her mother's cleverness, and the Baroness had fixed upon the Duke of Harcourt as Lucinda's destined husband with all the serene certainty of a woman who had never in her life been crossed in anything that mattered. That the Duke had shown no particular interest in Lucinda did not trouble her. Great men were slow, she told herself, and must be managed, and in the meantime she filled the waiting with the agreeable sport of mocking her social inferiors, of whom the spinster, Margaret Ashby, poor, plain by the Baroness's lights, and conveniently unable to retaliate, was a favorite target. It never once crossed the Baroness Frayne's mind that Margaret Ashby was a finer woman than herself in every way that signified, or that the Duke she was so confidently saving for Lucinda might have a pair of eyes and a mind of his own. The Baroness measured everyone by the things she valued, and by those measures Margaret was nothing and Lucinda was everything. And she went on giggling at the spinster and grooming her daughter and waiting for the Duke to do as she had decided he should, in a perfect, complacent blindness that would have been comic had it not been so unkind. She was about to be very thoroughly surprised, and the manner of her surprising, and the way her cruelty came home to roost, is one of the most satisfying things in this whole satisfying story, but it is best enjoyed slowly, and there's a great deal to tell first. A closer look at Lucinda Frayne, the daughter for whom the Baroness was so confidently saving the Duke, throws the whole contrast of the story into relief, for she was everything the world prized and Margaret was not, and the Duke's preference between them was a judgment on the world's whole scale of values. Lucinda was 19, and pretty in the insipid, fashionable way, with a good complexion, a great many ringlets, and a wardrobe that had cost more than Margaret had spent on herself and 5 children in a decade. She had been raised, from the cradle, to be exactly what she was, an ornament, an article of merchandise, a girl whose entire education had been directed at the single object of catching the richest husband her looks could command. She could play a little, and sing a little, and dance very well, and embroider, and make fashionable conversation about nothing. She had been taught to display these accomplishments to their best advantage and to regard the securing of a great match as the one serious business of her life. She was not wicked, exactly. She was simply hollow. A pretty vessel into which her mother had poured nothing but vanity and ambition, and she looked upon the spinster, Margaret Ashby, when she thought of her at all, with the same lazy contempt her mother felt, as a creature of no account who had failed at the only thing a woman was for. And the world, of course, agreed with the Fraynes entirely. By every standard that fashionable society recognized, Lucinda Frayne at 19 was worth 100 Margaret Ashbys at 30. She was young, she was pretty, she was fashionable, she was on the market and eager to be bought, and she had a mother of consequence to promote her. Margaret had none of these things. She had only a decade of unseen faithfulness, a heart schooled by sacrifice, a mind worth talking to, and a quiet integrity that asked nothing and could not be bought, and these, in the reckoning of the Baroness and her world, counted for precisely nothing. That was why the Duke's choice, when it came, fell upon that society like a slap, for in passing over the pretty marketable Lucinda to court the faded, unmarketable Margaret, the Duke of Harcourt was not merely choosing a wife, but pronouncing, before the whole watching county, that its entire scale of values was wrong, that worth was not youth, and not fashion, and not a clever mother, but something the gigglers had never learned to see, and the Baroness Frayne would never forgive him or Margaret for the lesson. The courtship, when it began, astonished the whole county, and no one more than Margaret Ashby herself, for she was the last woman in England to expect a duke, and she received his attentions with a composure that puzzled and delighted him in equal measure. He had come to her gate that first day on a sudden resolution, having argued himself into and out of it a dozen times, for a man so closely guarded does not lightly lay himself open, and to court Margaret Ashby was to risk, for the first time in years, the possibility of being refused, or worse, of being accepted for the wrong reasons after all. But he came, and he sat in her plain parlour with his hat in his hand and made the sort of stilted conversation a reserved man makes when his heart is more engaged than he will admit, and Margaret, who had not the smallest idea what he was about and assumed his call had some ordinary explanation, treated him with exactly the easy, unflustered kindness she would have shown any neighbor, gave him tea, asked after his mother the Dowager Duchess, and was altogether so little overcome by the honor of a ducal visit that the Duke went away more charmed than he had been by anything in 16 years. He came again, and then again, and by the third or fourth visit even Margaret, unworldly as she was, could no longer pretend to herself that the Duke of Harcourt was calling so often upon a spinster of 30 for the pleasure of the conversation alone. The county, of course, had understood it long before she did, and was scandalized and fascinated in equal measure. The news ran round the drawing-rooms that Harcourt, the great untouchable Harcourt, was dangling after the Ashby woman, the old maid who had raised all those children, and could not be got to look at a single one of the pretty girls flung in his path. It was the sensation of the season. And in the elegant drawing-room of the Baroness Frayne, where the joke about the unclaimed spinster had been told with such relish, the laughter died very suddenly indeed, and was replaced by an emotion a great deal less comfortable, for the Baroness, watching the Duke she had reserved for her daughter drive past her own gate week after week to sit in the parlour of a fated nobody, felt the first cold premonition that the world might not, after all, arrange itself entirely according to her wishes. The particular flavor of those first calls, before either of them would admit what was happening, was a thing worth lingering over, for it was in that stilted dance of two guarded people that the love took root. Picture them in the small plain parlour of Margaret's modest house, the great Duke, immaculate and out of place among the worn furniture, sitting bolt upright with his hat balanced on his knee, casting about for things to say, and Margaret, composed and unflustered, pouring his tea and conversing with the easy good manners of a woman who has decided that this inexplicable visit can have no possible bearing on herself. Neither would for the world have confessed the truth, that he had come because he could not stay away, she. That the sight of his carriage at her gate had set her heart beating in a way she sternly refused to examine. So they talked of safe things, of the parish and the weather and the books they had both read, and underneath the safe talk something quite different went on, a slow, careful testing and discovering, two lonely, intelligent people finding, almost against their wills, that they liked one another enormously. It was the books, in the end, that broke the ice between them. The Duke, casting about on his second visit for a topic, had noticed a well-worn volume on her table and made some remark about it, and Margaret, forgetting for a moment to be merely civil, had answered with an opinion so shrewd and so unexpected that the Duke had set down his teacup and looked at her properly for the first time. They had fallen, from there, into a real conversation. The first either had enjoyed and longer than they could remember, ranging and arguing and laughing, the Duke's cold reserve thawing into the dry wit that lay beneath it, and Margaret's careful composure warming into the lively intelligence she so seldom had occasion to use. And when at last he rose to go, far later than he had meant to stay, both of them knew, without a word said, that something had begun, though both, being who they were, spent the days that followed sternly explaining to themselves that it had not. The county's reaction, as the courtship became undeniable, was a spectacle in itself, and it laid bare the snobbery and the cruelty that lurk beneath the smooth surface of fashionable life. At first there was simple disbelief, the notion that the Duke of Harcourt, the great untouchable prize who had eluded the cleverest huntresses in England for 16 years, should at last be brought down by a penniless woman of 30, was so contrary to everything the county believed about the way the world worked that people simply refused to credit it. When disbelief became impossible, it gave way to a buzzing, scandalized fascination. The affair was the only topic in every drawing-room, dissected and exclaimed over and disapproved of with the particular relish that fashionable people reserve for the spectacle of someone breaking the rules they live by. And beneath the fascination ran a current of real unkindness, for the rise of so unlikely a bride was felt obscurely as an affront by every woman who had played the marriage game by its proper rules and won less than the spinster was about to win by, as they saw it, no rules at all. It was this resentment that the Baroness Frayne would later be able to work upon so effectively. But even before her slander, the county made its disapproval felt in 100 small cruelties aimed at Margaret. She was watched and whispered about and stared at. Her clothes and her manners and her family were picked over by people hoping to find her wanting. The old story of the children she had raised was retold with a sneer, as though her decade of sacrifice were some cunning bid for sympathy rather than the plain heroism it had been. And Margaret bore it, as she had borne everything, with a composure that gave the watchers nothing, but it told upon her, and it deepened the doubt already growing in her heart. For the louder the world marveled that a duke should stoop to her, the harder it grew for her to believe that he could really do so for any reason but a passing whim, and the more certain she became that she must be. In the end, an embarrassment to him that he would live to regret. Margaret's own heart through those strange weeks was a more complicated matter than the county guessed, for she was neither a fool nor a green girl, and she met the astonishing fact of a duke's courtship with a wariness born of her own hard-won self-knowledge. She liked him. That was the first thing, and it surprised her, for she had expected to find the great Duke of Harcourt cold and proud, and had found instead, beneath the guarded reserve, a man of real intelligence and dry humor and, she slowly came to suspect, a deep-buried loneliness not unlike her own. She found she could talk to him as she had never been able to talk to anyone since her parents died. That he listened, really listened, to her opinions, and seemed to value her plain good sense as no one in years had troubled to, and that his visits, which she had at first received as an inexplicable honor, became by degrees the brightest thing in her quiet weeks. But she did not let herself hope. She was 30 years old, and had buried her own youth, and knew exactly what she was, a worthy, faded, portionless spinster whom the world laughed at, and she could not for the life of her understand what a man like the Duke could truly want with such a woman, unless it were some passing fancy, or a cool desire for a sensible, undemanding wife who would give no trouble, or even a perverse wish to confound the matchmakers by choosing the very last woman they expected. And so she guarded her heart even as it slipped from her keeping. She would not let herself believe he loved her, because the disappointment, if she were wrong, would be more than she could bear, and she could not read his guarded reserve well enough to know what lay beneath it, for he was a man who had spent 20 years hiding his feelings, and even now, even with her, the habit held. And he courted her with a stilted carefulness that warmed her heart in one moment and chilled it with doubt in the next. She told herself sensibly that she must on no account fall in love with the Duke, who very likely did not love her, and she went on, helplessly and against all her sense, falling in love with him anyway, while taking the greatest care that he should never see it. And that whatever happened, the laughing world should never be able to say that Margaret Ashby had set her faded cap at a duke and made a fool of herself for a man above her reach. The loneliness that lay beneath the Duke's cold magnificence is the key to him, and it is worth understanding, for it explains both why he had armored himself so thoroughly and why the armor, once Margaret breached it, fell so completely. To be the most hunted man in England is, paradoxically, to be one of the loneliest. The Duke of Harcourt had been surrounded by eager company every day of his adult life, and had not had a single disinterested friendship offered him in 16 years, for he could never be sure of any warmth shown him that it was not aimed at his rank, his houses, his rent roll, the coronet that overshadowed the man. Women smiled at him, and he saw the calculation behind the smile. Men sought his friendship, and he suspected the favor they would presently ask. Even those who meant him no harm could not see past his greatness to the ordinary human creature beneath it, hungry, like any other, to be liked for himself. He had responded to this isolation as a proud man does, by embracing it, by deciding that since he could not be loved for himself, he would not court the counterfeit, would hold the whole grasping world at a cold arm's length, and would find what satisfaction he could in his own self-sufficiency. And he had told himself for years that the arrangement suited him, that he preferred his cold solitude to the false warmth on offer, that he needed no one. It was a lie, of course, as such bargains always are. Beneath the cold sufficiency the man was starving, as any human soul starves that is never once met as itself, and the proof of the starvation was the helpless violence of his response when the real thing finally appeared. When Margaret Ashby treated him as a man and not a prize, wanted nothing from him, valued his conversation over his coronet, and seemed scarcely to notice the coronet at all, she offered him, without knowing it, the one thing 16 years of fortune hunters had never offered, the chance to be loved for himself. And the starved heart beneath the armor reached for it with a desperation that frightened him precisely because it revealed how hungry he had been all along. The cynicism, the reserve, the cold pride were never the truth of him. They were the scar tissue grown over a wound, the calluses of a man too long handled as a thing. And Margaret, who had been handled as nothing for years and knew exactly what it was to be valued at the wrong rate, was the one person alive equipped to heal him, if only the two of them could find their way past the very defenses their separate sufferings had built. There was one conversation, midway through the courtship, that brought the two of them closer than all the rest. Though neither named what had passed, it was the evening the Duke let Margaret see, for the first time, a little of the loneliness behind his cold magnificence. They had been speaking idly of his great house, and Margaret had said something light about how grand it must be to live so, and the Duke had answered, after a pause, with an unexpected and uncharacteristic frankness, that a great house was a cold place to be lonely in, and that he had been lonely in his for the better part of 20 years. He had not meant to say it. It had come out before his guard could stop it, surprised out of him by the simple safety of her company, and having said it he had looked almost startled, as a man does who hears himself confess a thing he has never told a soul. Margaret had not exclaimed or pitied or made him feel he had betrayed himself. She had only said, quietly, that she understood loneliness very well, having kept her own company in a crowd for a good many years, and that she had found the only cure for it was the rare good fortune of meeting someone with whom one need not pretend. And the Duke had looked at her then with an expression she did not have a name for, and the silence that followed had been the most companionable either of them had ever known. It was a small thing, said and done in a few minutes, and they passed on directly to other subjects, but each of them carried it away and kept it. For the Duke it was the first time in his adult life he had let another human being see the lonely man behind the armored Duke and been met, not with calculation or with awe, but with simple fellow feeling, and the relief of it. The unexpected sweetness of being for once merely understood told him more than any reasoning could have done about what this woman was to him. And for Margaret it was the moment her stubborn hopelessness first cracked, just a little. For a man does not show a woman his loneliness, she thought, unless on some level he wishes her to come into it. And though she crushed the hope as she crushed all her hopes, it had taken root, and it never quite died again. They had each, in that quiet exchange, recognized in the other a fellow sufferer from the same disease, and glimpsed, without daring to say it, that they might be one another's cure. There was one person of consequence in the county who watched the Duke's courtship with unmixed delight, and that was his mother, the Dowager Duchess of Harcourt, who saw in Margaret Ashby exactly what her son saw, and a good deal that even he had not yet worked out. The Dowager Duchess was a formidable old lady of near 70, shrewd, plain-spoken, and entirely without the snobbery that ruled the smaller souls of her acquaintance. She had watched her son hunted for 16 years with a mixture of amusement and concern, had seen him grow cold and guarded and lonely under the long siege, and had very nearly given up hope of his ever marrying at all, let alone marrying for love. So that when she observed him beginning to drive across the county to sit in the parlour of a penniless spinster nobody, the old Duchess did not. Like the Baroness Frayne, throw up her hands in horror. She made it her business instead to find out about Margaret Ashby, and what she found out delighted her to the soul. Here was no fortune hunter, no simpering miss, no schemer. Here was a woman who had given 10 years of her life to raising her orphaned brothers and sisters, who had borne poverty and self-denial without complaint, who wanted nothing from the Duke and had not the smallest notion of catching him, and who possessed precisely the warm sense and unbought worth that the old Duchess most admired and had long despaired of finding in any of the bright creatures paraded before her son. She contrived to meet Margaret, and the meeting settled the matter in her mind forever. She found the spinster everything she had hoped, dignified without coldness, modest without servility, intelligent, kind, and so plainly unaware of her own worth that the old Duchess longed to shake her. And the Dowager Duchess of Harcourt, who feared no one and cared nothing for the opinion of the Baroness Fraynes of the world, made up her mind on the spot to champion the match with all the considerable weight of her consequence, to welcome Margaret, to encourage her son, and to take a particular grim pleasure in the discomfiture of all the matchmaking mothers whose schemes were about to come to nothing. "The boy has more sense than I gave him credit for," she observed to her companion, with deep satisfaction. "He has looked at a room full of painted dolls for 16 years and chosen the one woman among them with a soul. I begin to think there may be hope for him yet." The Dowager Duchess of Harcourt threw herself into the business of championing Margaret with a relish that did her credit and gave her more entertainment than she had had in years, and her methods are worth recording, for she was a general of no small skill. Her first move, once she had satisfied herself of Margaret's worth, was to make her own approval unmistakable to the whole county. She called, in state, upon the spinster the world was laughing at. She carried Margaret about with her in her own carriage, where everyone could see, she spoke of her, in the drawing-rooms where the slander would soon be brewing, with a pointed, warm approbation that dared anyone present to sneer. The old Duchess understood, as her son in his guarded way did not, that a great deal of the county's cruelty was simple cowardice, the safe baiting of a defenseless woman who had no powerful friends, and she set herself to supply the powerful friend, to range her own formidable consequence so plainly on Margaret's side that the smaller souls would think twice before their next unkindness. It was a shrewd campaign, and it shielded Margaret from a good deal that would otherwise have come at her. Her second move was upon her own son, and it was conducted with the bracing frankness of a mother who had never stood in awe of anybody. She saw, more clearly than the Duke did himself, both that he loved Margaret and that his cursed reserve was likely to ruin everything, and she told him so. In private, in terms that would have astonished the county that thought the Duke unanswerable, she warned him that a woman like Margaret, proud and self-respecting and long accustomed to being undervalued, would never presume upon his attentions, would never assume a love he did not plainly show, and might very well, out of that same proud humility, give him up entirely if he left her in doubt of his heart. She told him, in short, exactly what was about to happen, and begged him to find his tongue before it did. The Duke heard her out and knew she was right, and resolved a dozen times to speak plainly to Margaret, and a dozen times the habit of a lifetime closed his throat. His mother, watching, could only wait and hope the boy would come to it before the harm was done, and she was very nearly disappointed. The turn came, as such turns do, quietly on an ordinary afternoon, and it came not when the Duke decided to marry Margaret, but in the moment he understood, with a shock that shook him to his foundations, that he had fallen wholly and helplessly in love with her. The one thing 16 years of cynicism had taught him could never happen to him at all. He had told himself, in the beginning, a sensible, cynical story about what he was doing. He was tired of being hunted. He wanted a wife who would not bore or betray him. Margaret Ashby was a woman of sense and worth, who would make a comfortable, dignified, undemanding duchess and ask nothing of his heart, which he had long since concluded he did not possess. It was, he told himself, a rational arrangement between two people past the age of romantic folly. He had believed his own story for several weeks. And then, on an ordinary afternoon in her parlor, watching her laugh at some dry remark of his with her whole face lit and warm, he felt something turn over in his chest that had nothing rational about it whatever, and he understood. All at once and beyond any possibility of denial, that the comfortable arrangement he had been telling himself about had become, somewhere along the way, the deepest and most desperate love of his life. It frightened him more than anything had ever frightened him. For a man who had armored himself for 16 years in the conviction that he could not be loved for himself and would never be fool enough to love, to discover that he had fallen hopelessly and at 38 for a portionless spinster the whole world laughed at, was to feel the entire careful structure of his cynicism collapse beneath him. The cold, weary Duke who trusted no one's affection, who had held the world at arm's length for half his life, who had been so sure that love was a fiction got up by fortune hunters to catch rich men, found himself laid bare by the very thing he had denied, and the discovery was at once the most wonderful and the most terrifying of his life. He loved her. He, Harcourt, the great cynic, the unconquerable prize, loved a faded spinster of 30 with all the pent-up, starved devotion of a heart that had been frozen for 16 years and had thawed, without his leave, in the warmth of the one true woman he had ever found. And now he had to do something far harder than feel it. He had to find a way to say it. That he could not easily say it was the heart of the trouble, and the thing that very nearly cost him everything. For the same long cynicism that had kept his heart safe for 16 years had also taught it to stay hidden, and a man does not unlearn in a month the habit of a lifetime. The reveal of this story, if it has one, is just here, that the Duke of Harcourt, having at last found love, was almost incapable of showing it. He had spent so long guarding himself, hiding what he felt, trusting no one with his heart, that now, when he most needed to lay it open, he could not. The words would not come. The warmth he felt turned, on its way to the surface, into the same stilted cold reserve that was his lifelong armor. He courted Margaret with a careful, undemonstrative correctness that hid the passion beneath it so well that even he could see it was not enough. He wanted to tell her that she was the only real thing in his hollow, gilded life, that he loved her past all sense and reason, that she had thawed a heart he had thought dead for good, and what came out, when he tried, was a stiff, measured civility that might have meant anything or nothing. He, who could face down any man in England, could not find the courage to be seen wanting something he might be denied. And so the very depth of his love, working through the armor of his reserve, produced exactly the impression most likely to wound the woman he loved. Margaret, watching him, saw a man who called on her faithfully but never warmly, who seemed to esteem her, to find her useful and sensible and good company, but who showed no spark of the thing she had not dared to hope for, and she concluded, with the bleak good sense that 10 years of disappointment had taught her, that the Duke of Harcourt regarded her as a suitable and convenient choice, a dignified, sensible spinster who would make him a comfortable wife, and nothing more. She did not blame him for it. She thought it, indeed, the likeliest and most rational thing in the world. What else, after all? Could such a man feel for such a woman? But the conclusion broke something in her, quietly, for she had gone and fallen in love with him in spite of all her resolutions, and to be chosen coolly for her usefulness by the man she loved with her whole starved heart seemed to her a colder fate even than the spinsterhood the world laughed at. The Duke loved her to distraction and could not say it. Margaret loved him with all her soul and was sure he did not. And into that cruel little gap of silence and misunderstanding the Baroness Frayne was about to pour her poison. There were particular moments in the courtship that Margaret kept and turned over in her mind ever after, small ordinary scenes that, taken together, were the slow falling of two careful people into a love neither would name. There was the afternoon he found her in her garden, on her knees among the herbs with her sleeves pushed up and a smudge of earth on her cheek, and she had been mortified to be caught so unfashionably at work. But he had only looked at her with an expression she could not read and said, quietly, that he had never in his life seen anything he liked so well, and she had not known what to make of it for a week. There was the evening he came upon her reading to a sick child in a cottage, her voice low and tender in the firelight, and stood in the doorway unnoticed for a long moment with a look on his face that the child's mother, glancing up, never forgot. There were the long conversations that ran later and later as the weeks went on, in which they argued and laughed and fell silent together with the ease of people who have known one another for years. And there was the gradual, wondering discovery, on Margaret's side, that the cold, proud Duke was in private a man of deep feeling and dry humor and surprising gentleness. Lonelier than she had guessed, and, she began almost to hope, not indifferent to her after all, but she would not let the hope grow. Every time it stirred, she crushed it, with the hard-won discipline of a woman who had taught herself for 10 years to expect nothing for herself, for to hope that the Duke of Harcourt loved her, and to be wrong, was a humiliation and a grief she did not think she could survive, and it seemed to her the wildest of presumptions besides. So she took the moments as they came and treasured them in secret, and told herself they were the friendship of a lonely great man for a sensible woman and nothing more, and she fell, all the while, deeper and deeper in love with a completeness that frightened her, and that she hid from him so successfully that he, in his own uncertainty, took her careful composure for indifference, and was as much in the dark about her heart as she was about his. They were two people made for each other, each loving the other with a full heart, and each so schooled by a lifetime of being undervalued that neither could believe themselves loved in return, and the pity of it. And the very near tragedy of it was that their separate humilities might so easily have kept them apart forever. There was a particular evening at a county assembly early in the courtship when the Baroness Frayne could not resist a public thrust at her rival, and the manner in which Margaret met it won her, though she never knew it, a witness who would matter later. The Baroness had chosen her moment with care, a crowded room, Margaret standing a little apart as she usually did, the Duke not yet arrived. Sailing up with Lucinda in tow and an audience conveniently near, the Baroness had addressed Margaret with a sweetness more wounding than any open insult, condoling with her loudly on how trying it must be, at her age and in her situation, to have become the object of such very marked attentions from the Duke, attentions which, the Baroness was sure, dear Miss Ashby was far too sensible to misunderstand or to build any foolish hopes upon. It was beautifully done. It managed in a single speech to remind the room of Margaret's age, her poverty, and her presumption, and to suggest that the Duke's interest was a passing whim that only a vain old maid could mistake for anything more, and the listening circle waited, with pleasant anticipation, for the spinster to blush, or stammer, or betray the mortification the Baroness had so artfully aimed at. Margaret did none of these things. She looked at the Baroness for a moment with a clear, steady gaze in which there was not the smallest trace of discomposure, and then she answered, in a voice perfectly pleasant and perfectly even, that she was indeed far too sensible to build hopes upon anything, but that she had found it wisest, in a long life of small means, to leave the reading of gentlemen's intentions to the gentlemen themselves, and to trouble herself meanwhile with neither hope nor fear, and she inquired, with a courtesy so genuine it could not be called a counterstroke, after Lucinda's health. It was a masterpiece of dignified deflection. It gave the malice nothing to fasten on, turned the thrust harmlessly aside, and left the Baroness, for all her advantage, looking faintly the worse of the exchange, and an elderly gentleman standing near, a shrewd old friend of the Dowager Duchess, who had come prepared to be amused at the spinster's expense, found himself instead unexpectedly impressed, and remarked to the Duchess afterward that the Ashby woman had more quality in her little finger than the Baroness Frayne had in her whole fashionable body, a verdict that, repeated in the right quarter, did Margaret no harm at all. The change in the Baroness Frayne as the Duke's intentions toward the spinster grew unmistakable was a study in how quickly a cruel amusement curdles into a vicious hatred when the inferior one laughed at threatens to rise above the one who laughed. For a few weeks the Baroness had refused to believe it. The Duke's calls upon the Ashby woman were a whim, she told herself, a passing eccentricity. He would tire of the novelty and come back to his senses and to Lucinda. But as the weeks passed and the calls did not stop, as it became plain to the whole county that Harcourt was in deadly earnest about the spinster, the Baroness's complacency gave way first to alarm, then to fury, and at last to a settled cold determination to break the thing off by any means in her power. It was not only that her daughter's great match was slipping away, though that was bitter enough. It was that the woman carrying it off was the very spinster she had so publicly and so often laughed at, the fated nobody she had held up to the county's ridicule. And the prospect of seeing that woman become Duchess of Harcourt, raised over her head, mistress of the greatest house in the county, was a humiliation the Baroness Frayne found she could not endure. The mockery turned, as such mockery does when it is thwarted, into something far uglier. And the Baroness, for all her idle foolishness, was clever enough in malice to know where to aim. She understood two things: that Margaret's whole strength lay in her unblemished good name and her quiet dignity, and that the Duke's whole character was built on his cynical distrust of fortune-hunters. So she shaped her poison to strike at both. She began to spread, through the soft channels of fashionable gossip, a new version of the story that the demure Miss Ashby was no innocent at all, but the cleverest fortune-hunter of them all, that the whole pose of the self-sacrificing spinster who wanted nothing was a calculated performance designed to snare exactly the kind of jaded great man who would be sick of obvious arts, that she had set her faded cap at the Duke with a cunning that made the open angling of the debutantes look like child's play, and was about to land by sheer artful patience the greatest prize in England. It was a lie exactly fitted to its purpose. It threatened to befoul Margaret's good name, which was all she had, and it was precisely calculated to wake the Duke's deepest fear, the lifelong dread that he could not be loved for himself, and to whisper that even this woman, this last seemingly genuine woman, was only one more hunter, cleverer than the rest. The Baroness loosed it upon the county with a glad malice, and sat back to watch it do its work. The exact mechanics of the Baroness Frayne's malice are worth tracing. For she was a fool in most things, but a positive artist in the doing of harm, and the slander she contrived was a small masterpiece of its wicked kind. She did not, being too clever for that, invent some gross and disprovable falsehood. A charge of outright wickedness would have been laughed down, for Margaret's spotless character was too well known. What the Baroness did instead was far subtler and far harder to answer. She took the truth, the whole admirable truth of Margaret's life, and gave it a quarter turn into something ugly. The self-sacrificing spinster who had raised her orphan siblings became, in the Baroness's retelling, a calculating woman who had spent 10 years building a reputation for saintly self-denial precisely so as to be irresistible to a certain kind of jaded man. The very fact that Margaret had never angled for the Duke became the proof of her cunning for what was such pointed indifference. The Baroness asked with a knowing smile, but the cleverest angling of all, the one bait that a man sick of being chased could not resist? The Baroness took every virtue and recast it as a deeper vice, every proof of innocence as a subtler proof of guile, and because the recasting fitted so neatly over the facts and flattered the malice of an envious audience, it spread like a stain through the county. It was, moreover, aimed with a deadly understanding of both its victims. Against Margaret, it threatened the one thing she had left, her unblemished name, and the one fear she most dreaded, that the world should call her a husband-hunter after all her years of wanting nothing. And against the Duke, it was aimed straight at the old wound of his life, the conviction that no woman could love him for himself, for if even Margaret, even this seemingly genuine woman, were secretly a fortune-hunter cleverer than the rest, then his whole bitter philosophy was confirmed, and the one exception that had given him hope was poisoned at the root. The Baroness Frayne, who had no idea of the depth of either heart she was attacking, had none the less found by pure malicious instinct the precise point at which each was most vulnerable, and had she been dealing with two slightly weaker people or two slightly more divided ones, her poison would very probably have done exactly what she meant it to do. The poison did its work, though not in the simple way the Baroness intended, for it did not turn the Duke against Margaret, as the Baroness hoped, but it found out the weak place in each of them, and very nearly parted them by working on their separate fears. The slander reached Margaret first, as such things have a cruel way of reaching the one they most concern. She heard it in the half-pitying, half-malicious hints of acquaintances, understood, with a sick lurch, exactly what was being said of her all over the county, and felt the ground she stood on give way. For the lie was the one thing she could not bear to have believed of her, that she, who had wanted nothing, who had guarded her heart so fiercely precisely so that no one could ever say she had thrown it at a duke, was being called the cleverest fortune-hunter in England. And worse, far worse, was the fear the slander woke in her about the Duke himself. She knew his history. She knew how the world had hunted him. She knew that his whole guarded nature was built on the dread of being caught by a scheming woman. And she thought, if he hears this, if this poison reaches him, how can he help but wonder? How can a man so steeped in suspicion not look at the demure spinster he has been courting and feel the cold doubt creep in that perhaps she is exactly what they say? She could not bear that he should look at her so, and she could not bear, either, the thought that she might be the ruin of him, that by letting a duke court a laughed-at spinster, she might be dragging his great name into the mud of scandal and ridicule for her own sake. The Duke, for his part, did hear the slander, and it cost him a single bad night for the old reflex of suspicion. 16 years deep, did stir in him for an hour, did whisper the question the Baroness had designed it to whisper. But he was a better and a wiser man than the Baroness knew, and the suspicion did not survive the morning, for he had only to call up Margaret's face, her plain, serene goodness, the whole truth of her that he had watched for months, to know the lie for a lie, and to feel a cold fury at the malice that had loosed it. The danger, in the end, came not from the Duke's believing the slander, but from his old fatal inability to say what he felt. For while he had privately dismissed the lie and resolved to crush it, he did not think, in his guarded reserve, to go at once to Margaret, to take her hands, to tell her plainly that he did not believe a word of it and never could, that he loved her and trusted her and would defend her before the world. He meant to deal with it in his own cold, competent way, behind the scenes, and he left her all the while in an agony of uncertainty, believing herself slandered to the man she loved and unsure whether he doubted her, and drawing, in that silence, the conclusion that would so nearly break them both. The Duke's own reception of the slander, on the night it reached him, is worth setting beside Margaret's, for it shows both how nearly the Baroness succeeded and how completely, in the end, she had mistaken her man. He heard it from a fellow he half trusted, dropped as a friendly warning over the wine, that the Duke would do well to look closely at his demure Miss Ashby, for the world was saying she was the cleverest huntress of them all, and her saintly indifference the subtlest snare ever set for a wary man. And for the space of one bad hour, the old reflex stirred. 16 years of suspicion do not vanish in a season, and the whisper had been crafted, though the Duke did not know by whom, to strike at the very root of his lifelong dread. He went home and sat up late, and the cold serpent of doubt that had guarded his heart for half his life lifted its head one last time and hissed the old question. What if it were true? What if even she, even this one woman he had let himself believe in, were only another hunter, the most accomplished of all, and he the greatest fool of all for being taken in? But the doubt did not survive the night, and the manner of its dying showed how far he had already come. For he found, when he tried to entertain the suspicion, that he could not, that it would not fit the woman he knew. He called up her face, her unconscious kindness to the sick child, her clear eyes that asked him for nothing. The plain serene goodness he had watched for months, in 100 unguarded moments no actress could have sustained, and he knew, with a certainty that steadied him like solid ground underfoot, that the thing was a lie, and a vicious one, and that the woman he loved was exactly what she appeared to be and nothing else. The relief of that knowing was itself a revelation to him, for it meant that the long cynicism had been broken after all, that he had at last found someone he could trust past the reach of any slander, and the discovery moved him more than he expected. By morning his doubt had hardened into a cold and dangerous anger against whoever had loosed the lie, and he resolved, in his own competent way, to find the source and crush it. His only mistake, and it was nearly a fatal one, was that in all his cold resolving he never thought to go straight to Margaret and tell her simply that he did not believe a word of it, for it did not occur to the guarded man that she might be breaking her heart in the silence, taking his very discretion for doubt, and preparing in her wounded pride to set him free. The day the slander reached Margaret's own ears in full was the worst she had known since the year her parents died, and the way it came to her made it the harder to bear. It came, as the cruelest news so often does, in the guise of kindness. A neighbor, a Mrs. Caldwell, who passed for Margaret's friend and was not unkind by her own lights, came to call with the express purpose. Under cover of warning, of retailing to Margaret every wounding particular of what the county was saying, she did it with many sighs and protestations of sympathy, the better to enjoy the effect, how it was being said everywhere that Miss Ashby had played a deep game, how her years of devotion to her brothers and sisters were now being called a calculated performance, how the very modesty and indifference she had shown the Duke were being held up as the proof of her cunning, how the whole county was agreed that the demure Miss Ashby was in truth the most accomplished fortune-hunter of the age, and the Duke a poor deceived man caught at last by an art subtler than all the rest. Mrs. Caldwell delivered it all in tones of the deepest commiseration, watching Margaret's face, and then took her leave well satisfied, having done as much harm in half an hour as the Baroness could have wished. When she had gone, Margaret sat a long time alone in the quiet parlour, and let the full weight of it settle on her. It was not the insult to herself that she found hardest, wounding as that was. It was the deeper implications that she could not push away. For the first time she saw the courtship not as it had been to her, a thing of wonder and secret painful hope, but as it must look to the cold, malicious eye of the world, and as it might, she thought with a sick lurch, come to look even to the Duke, a great man making a fool of himself over a scheming nobody. And she thought of his history, of the 16 years of fortune hunters, of the suspicion that was the very ground of his nature, and she asked herself how such a man, hearing such a story whispered everywhere, could fail in time to wonder whether it were true, and to look at her with the cold doubt that she could not have borne to see in his eyes. She did not know that he had already heard it and already dismissed it. She knew only that a poison was abroad that fitted his deepest fear like a key to a lock, and that she loved him too well to be the cause of his unhappiness, or the ruin of his peace, or the stain upon his honored name. And somewhere in that long, bitter afternoon the resolution began to form in her that would carry her, a few days later, to offer him his freedom. And so Margaret Ashby, alone with her fear and her pride and her hopeless love, made the decision that nearly cost her happiness. She resolved to give the Duke up before he could be made to regret her, and she went to him to set him free. She had thought it through in the long watches of a sleepless night, with the bleak clear-sightedness that was both her strength and, here, her undoing. She loved him, she was sure he did not love her, but esteemed her coolly as a sensible choice, and now a vile slander was abroad that named her a fortune-hunter and threatened to drag his honored name through the ridicule of the whole county. All for the sake of a faded spinster who could bring him nothing but the world's laughter and a tarnished reputation. What right had she asked herself, to let him pay so dear for so cool a regard? What was her own breaking heart against the duty of sparing the man she loved a scandal he had not deserved? She would not be the ruin of him. She would not be the scheming spinster the world was already calling her. She would do the one dignified thing left to her. She would release him from the courtship before it cost him anything more, and bear her own loss in the silence she had borne everything else. She went to him the next day, pale and composed, and said her piece with a steadiness that cost her more than he ever knew. She told him that she had heard the things being said, that she would not for the world be the cause of scandal or ridicule to him, that she was sensible of the great honor of his attentions, but understood perfectly that a connection with a woman so circumstanced, so talked of, could bring him nothing but trouble, and that she begged him, therefore, to consider himself entirely free, and to let their acquaintance lapse quietly before the county's malice did him any further harm. She said it well. She said it as a woman of 30 who had long practice in giving up what she wanted says it, with dignity and without tears, offering him his freedom as the last gift of a love she was too proud to name. And she waited, with her heart in pieces, for the Duke of Harcourt to take the easy, honorable escape she had just held open for him, and to go. What it cost Margaret to go to the Duke and offer him his freedom, no one but herself ever fully knew, and the courage of it, the quiet, unregarded courage of a woman doing the hardest thing of her life with no witness and no reward, deserves to be set down plainly. She had not slept. She had spent the night reasoning herself, step by painful step, to the only conclusion her pride and her love would let her reach, and she had risen pale and steady in the morning with her mind made up and her heart, she thought, already broken past further breaking. She dressed with particular care as a soldier might before a battle, and she rehearsed what she would say until she could say it without a tremor, for she was determined, whatever it cost, that she would carry this through with dignity, that she would not weep, would not plead, would not let the Duke see for one instant the wreck that the saying of it would make of her. She would give him his freedom cleanly, as a gift. She would let him go without a stain on his honor or a claim on his conscience, and she would keep, out of the ruin, the one thing she could keep, which was the knowledge that she had loved him well enough to set him free. And she did it. She sat in her own small parlour, the very room where the courtship had begun, and she said her piece to the man she loved with a composure that was itself a kind of heroism, told him she released him, that she would not be the cause of scandal to him, that he must consider their acquaintance at an end. And through it all she kept her voice even and her eyes steady, and gave no sign of the agony. Beneath, she thought she was being merely sensible. She did not understand that the very perfection of her composure, the dignity that cost her so much, was the most eloquent proof of love she could possibly have offered, that no woman goes to such lengths or pays such a price in self-command to give up a man she does not love with her whole soul. She believed she was hiding her heart. In truth, she was laying it bare, more completely than any confession could have done, and the man watching her, who had eyes to see, saw straight through the brave, composed surface to the breaking thing beneath, and was undone by it. But the Duke of Harcourt did not go, for Margaret's offer of his freedom, made so bravely and so wrongly, accomplished the one thing nothing else had managed to do, and broke through the armor of his reserve at last. He sat for a moment in stunned silence, understanding as she spoke, the whole shape of the misunderstanding that had grown between them, that she thought he did not love her, that she believed he courted her from cool convenience, that she was, out of love and pride and a hopeless generosity, trying to give him up to spare him a scandal, when all the while he had been loving her past all reason and failing, through his cursed lifelong reserve, to let her see one particle of it. And the sight of her sitting there, pale and steady, offering him his freedom as a gift, while her heart broke behind her composed face, did what 16 years and the warmth of love itself had not been able to do. It shattered his reserve completely, and brought the whole of his guarded, hidden heart pouring out at last. He did not let her finish her dignified retreat. He crossed the room and took her hands, the cold, proud Duke of Harcourt, and he told her the truth, all of it, in a rush of words such as he had not spoken in his whole guarded life. He told her that he did not want his freedom and would not take it, that he had not been courting her from convenience but loving her to distraction, that she was the only real and true thing in his whole hollow gilded existence, the one woman in 16 years who had wanted nothing from him and given him everything, and that the notion of her as a fortune hunter was so grotesque a lie that he had dismissed it in the same breath he heard it. He told her that the fault was all his own, that he had loved her for weeks and been too long a coward, too long armored, too long afraid of being seen to want what he might be refused, to find the words, and that he saw now, with horror, that his cursed silence had nearly let her give him up, believing herself unloved. And then the Duke of Harcourt, who had not asked anyone for anything in 16 years, asked Margaret Ashby, with his whole heart naked in his face at last, not to spare him, not to free him, but to marry him, not as a sensible arrangement, but because he loved her beyond his power to say, and could not face the rest of his life without her in it. For the Duke of Harcourt, the moment Margaret offered him his freedom was the hinge on which his whole life turned, and what happened inside him in that moment is the true climax of this story, more than any public scene that followed. He had come that morning meaning, in his guarded way, to reassure her, to say something cool and steadying about the foolish talk, to let her understand obliquely that it need not trouble her, and to go on as before. He had not meant to declare himself. The habit of a lifetime still held. He had told himself there was time, that the thing could be managed quietly, that a great explosion of feeling was neither necessary nor in his line. And then she had begun to speak, and he had understood, with a slowly dawning horror, what she was actually doing, that she was not asking for reassurance but giving him up, that she believed he did not love her, that out of love and pride she was tearing herself away to spare him, and meant to walk out of his life forever with that brave broken composure, and that in another 5 minutes she would have done it, and it would have been too late. And in that moment the whole structure of his reserve, the cold, careful armor of 16 years, simply shattered, for he saw, with a clarity that struck him like a blow, exactly what his silence had done and was about to do. He saw that his guardedness, the thing he had always taken for strength, had been about to cost him the one good thing his life had ever offered him. That while he had been managing the affair coolly and competently and saying nothing, the woman he loved had been breaking her heart in silence and preparing to vanish, believing herself unloved. He saw that there is a kind of caution that is merely cowardice, and a kind of reserve that is merely the fear of being seen to want, and that he had been a coward in this one thing all his careful life, and the seeing burned all the cowardice away in an instant. The man who had not let himself be seen to want anything in 16 years discovered, in the face of losing her, that he did not care any longer who saw what he wanted, that he would beg, plead, abase himself, do anything rather than let her walk out of that door believing he did not love her. And he crossed the room and took her hands and began, for the first time in his guarded life, to tell a woman the whole truth of his heart. What Margaret felt, as the Duke's words broke over her, is not easily told, for it was the undoing of 10 years of careful hopelessness in the space of a few minutes, and the heart does not adjust so fast without a kind of beautiful violence. She had come braced for his agreement. She had been so certain of what would happen, so sure he would take the freedom she offered with relief or at most with a few civil regrets, that for a moment, when he crossed the room and seized her hands and began instead to pour out a passionate, disordered confession of love, she could not take it in at all. She stood rigid and disbelieving. Certain she must have misheard, unable to make the words mean what they seemed to mean. It was only as he went on, as the truth came tumbling out of him, the weeks of love he had hidden, the cowardice of his silence, the horror of nearly losing her, the plain, desperate declaration that he loved her beyond his power to say, that the thing began to reach her, and when it reached her at last, when she understood that this proud, guarded man was standing before her with his whole heart in his hands, that she was loved, truly and deeply loved, by the one man she had thought could never love her, the careful structure of her hopelessness gave way all at once, and she wept, for the first time through the whole ordeal. Not from grief, but from a joy so sudden and so enormous it could find no other outlet. For she had spent 10 years teaching herself to want nothing, to expect nothing, to fold away her own hopes and live for others and ask the world for no happiness of her own, and the discipline had gone so deep that the arrival of happiness, when it came, was almost more than she could bear. She had believed herself a woman whose time was past, who had spent her one youth in service and must live out her days unclaimed and unloved, and here was the proof, in the broken voice and the naked face of the man she loved, that she had been wrong, that her time was not past but only beginning, that the long, lonely road had been leading her, all along, to this. She did not give a graceful answer. She had no graceful answer to give. She only held his hands and wept and laughed, and at last told him, in words as plain and broken as his own, that she had loved him for months and never dared to hope, and that yes, 1,000 times yes, she would be his wife. And the two of them, who had each been so sure they could not be loved, stood in the small plain parlour and held one another and understood that they had both been wrong in the best way two people can ever be wrong. There remained the Baroness Frayne and her slander to be dealt with, and the Duke of Harcourt, having found his voice at last, dealt with them in a manner the county did not forget for a generation. He chose the most public ground he could find, the great spring ball, the very heart of the fashionable season, at which the Baroness Frayne herself would be holding court, and her daughter Lucinda would be on conspicuous display, and to which all the county that had laughed at the spinster and whispered the slander would be gathered. He brought Margaret to it, on his arm, magnificently gowned at his mother's delighted insistence, and with the Dowager Duchess of Harcourt herself sailing beside her in awful state, and the entrance of the great Duke with the slandered spinster, attended by his formidable mother, fell upon the assembled county like a thunderclap. And then, before the whole watching-room, the Duke of Harcourt did what no one present had ever seen the cold, reserved man do in his life. He wore his heart upon his face for all to see, and made it unmistakable, by every look and word and attention, that he was not merely courting Margaret Ashby, but adored her, and when the moment was right, he announced, in a voice that carried to every corner of the silent room, that Miss Ashby had done him the honor of consenting to become his wife, and that he counted himself the most fortunate man in England. What that evening at the great spring ball was like for Margaret herself, standing at the center of the brilliant room on the Duke's arm, while the county that had laughed at her was forced to look, was a thing she carried in her heart for the rest of her life. She had not wanted to come. The thought of facing, in one glittering room, the whole assembled society that had whispered and sneered and called her a fortune hunter was almost more than her courage could manage, and it was only the Duke's quiet insistence, and the Dowager Duchess's flat declaration that she would countenance no skulking, that brought her there at all. But come she did, magnificently gowned for the first time in her life and trembling inwardly, and she stepped into that blaze of light and music on the arm of the greatest man in the county, and felt every eye in the room turn and fix upon her. For one terrible moment the old instinct to shrink, to efface herself, to be the worthy, invisible spinster below the salt, rose up and nearly overwhelmed her. And then something steadier rose up beneath it, the same deep inward certainty of her own worth that 10 years of unregarded faithfulness had built in her, the knowledge that whatever this room thought of her, she had done nothing to be ashamed of and everything to be proud of, and that the man beside her, who knew her better than any of them, had chosen her before them all. She lifted her head. She met the staring eyes with the same serene composure she had always met the world's slights, only now there was joy behind it, and the quiet, unanswerable dignity of a woman standing exactly where she belonged. She did not own the room by triumphing over her enemies. She owned it simply by being, unmistakably and before them all, a woman of real quality, gracious and unafraid, with the love of a great man plainly written in his every glance at her, and the room, which had come prepared to pity or to sneer, found itself instead, almost against its will, beginning to admire. The spinster they had laughed at stood among them transformed, not by her gown or her sudden grandeur, but by the simple public revelation of what she had always been. And more than one person in that glittering crowd felt a small private shame at having been so long and so easily blind. It was a rout. The slander could not survive it, for who could go on whispering that the spinster had entrapped a reluctant duke, with the duke himself standing there plainly besotted, glorying in his choice before the world? And the duke was not content merely to silence the lie. He traced it, coldly and publicly, to its source. He let it be known, with a few well-chosen words to the right ears and a freezing courtesy to the Baroness Frayne herself that was more crushing than any open insult, that he knew exactly who had set the slander going and why, and that the lady who had amused herself by laughing at Miss Ashby and then by maligning her would find the doors of Harcourt, and of every house that valued the Duke's friendship, henceforth closed to her. The Baroness Frayne, who had giggled that the spinster was unclaimed at 30, was made to stand in that brilliant room and watch the woman she had mocked accept the homage of the greatest man in the county as his honored and adored bride, and Lucinda, the destined duchess, stood pretty and forgotten at her mother's side, and the laugh came round at last, as it always does. And it was not the Baroness who laughed. The Dowager Duchess of Harcourt's enjoyment of the whole triumph was a thing of beauty, and she made not the smallest pretence of humility about her own large share in bringing it about. She had stage-managed the evening with a general's eye. It was she who had insisted Margaret be dressed as befitted the future Duchess of Harcourt, and who had overseen the gowning herself with grim satisfaction, declaring that the county should see Miss Ashby looking every inch what she was, and not be given the chance to call her dowdy on top of everything else. It was she who sailed into the ballroom at Margaret's side, lending the immense shelter of her own consequence, and who placed herself so that any guest inclined to a slight would have to deliver it under the basilisk eye of the most formidable old lady in 3 counties. And it was she who took a frank and unholy pleasure in watching the discomfiture of the matchmaking mothers, the Baroness Frayne above all, whose long campaign she had observed with contempt, and whose downfall she now savored like a fine wine. She was generous in victory only to Margaret. To her son she was bracingly unsentimental, remarking that he had come within an ace of making a complete fool of himself, and might thank his stars and his mother that he had been saved in time. To Margaret she was all warmth, taking the girl under her wing with a fierce, protective fondness that Margaret, starved of mothering for so many years, found almost unbearably moving. And to the company at large the Dowager Duchess made her position blazingly clear, that she regarded Margaret Ashby as the best thing that had ever happened to her son and her house, that anyone who thought otherwise might keep their opinion and their company to themselves, and that she, the Dowager Duchess of Harcourt, took the entire credit for the match and would hear no argument about it. It was not perhaps strictly accurate, but no one was disposed to contradict her, and Margaret, who owed the old lady more than she could say, let her have the credit, and loved her for the having of it. The downfall of the Baroness Frayne, when it came, was complete, and it carried the particular satisfaction of a punishment that fit the crime exactly, for she was undone by the very weapons she had chosen to use. She had ruled her little world by two things: by social position and by the power to make or mar a reputation through fashionable gossip. The Duke of Harcourt, with a few cold words in the right ears, stripped her of both. By making it known that he held her personally responsible for the slander against his betrothed, and that he would account it a personal affront in anyone who continued to receive her on easy terms, he turned the whole apparatus of fashionable opinion, which the Baroness had wielded so freely against Margaret, against the Baroness herself. The doors that had stood open to her began, one by one, to close, invitations dwindled, the friends who had laughed at her jokes discovered pressing reasons to be elsewhere, and the woman who had giggled so comfortably at the spinster's expense found herself, within a season, very nearly as isolated as she had tried to make her victim, and a good deal less equipped to bear it. There was a rough justice in it that the county did not fail to relish. The Baroness had built her whole consequence on the favor of the great, and had used that consequence to torment a defenseless woman for sport, and now the greatest of the great had withdrawn his favor and left her exposed to exactly the cold unkindness she had dealt out so freely. As for Lucinda, the destined duchess, she was quietly married off a year or two later to a respectable squire of no particular distinction, which was a better fate than her mother's schemes deserved for her, and she dwindled into the ordinary obscurity of a country wife, her brief candidacy for a coronet forgotten by everyone but her mother, who never quite stopped feeling that the world had cheated her of something that was rightfully hers. They were not wicked enough, mother or daughter, to merit any darker ending, but the loss of the great match and the slow social chill that followed it were punishment enough. And the spectacle of it gave Margaret's well-wishers a satisfaction they were too polite to voice and too human not to feel. The marriage that followed was worth all the long, lonely years it had cost each of them to come to it, for it was that rarest of things, a union of two equals who had each found in the other exactly what their separate lives had lacked. He gave her the security and the cherishing she had never had, a place of honor after a lifetime below the salt, a home and a name and a settled love, and the deep daily tenderness of a man making up to her, with a kind of grateful astonishment, for all the years the world had undervalued her. She gave him the one thing his rank had never been able to buy, the certainty of being loved for himself, simply and wholly, by a woman who had loved the man before she ever thought of the Duke, and who went on loving him with a steady warmth that slowly, over the years, melted the last of the frost the long siege had laid on his heart. They suited each other as few couples do. They could talk endlessly, as they had talked from that first afternoon over the books. They shared the management of his estates and the care of his dependents, for Margaret's decade of contriving on a slender income made her a shrewd and tender mistress of a great house. And they understood each other, in the wordless way of two people who have each known what it is to be valued at the wrong. Rate, with a completeness that needed no explaining. And the Duke learned, under the daily warmth of her love, to be the open and affectionate man his cynicism had so long buried. It did not happen all at once. The habits of a guarded lifetime gave way slowly, and there were times, early on, when the old reserve would close over him, and Margaret would have to wait. With the patience she had in such large store, for it to lift again, but it lifted always, and year by year the cold sardonic Duke the world had known grew warmer and gentler and more plainly happy, until the very people who had known him in his proud isolation could scarcely believe he was the same man. He had her to thank for it, and he knew it, and he never tired of telling her so, for he had spent half his life believing love a fiction, and she had taught him, late but not too late, that it was the only thing that had ever been real. The speed with which the county reversed its opinion once the betrothal was beyond question was a lesson in the worth of the world's judgment that Margaret never forgot and could never afterward take quite seriously. The very people who had whispered that she was a fortune hunter, who had laughed at her age and her poverty and her presumption, discovered, the moment it was certain she would be Duchess of Harcourt, that they had always known her for a most superior woman. The transformation was wonderful to behold. Acquaintances who had cut her now sought her out. Matrons who had pitied her now claimed a long and intimate friendship. The same drawing-rooms that had relished the Baroness's jokes at her expense now competed to declare that they had seen Miss Ashby's quality from the first, and had always said the Duke could not do better. Invitations poured in where doors had lately been closed. Her plain gowns, unchanged, were suddenly pronounced the height of quiet good taste. Her decade of devotion to her brothers and sisters, so lately sneered at as calculation, was now held up everywhere as the most beautiful example of womanly virtue, exactly as it had always been. Margaret watched the whole performance with a wry private amusement that she was too kind to show. She harbored no bitterness. She had long ago stopped expecting consistency or courage from the fashionable world, and the spectacle of its scramble to befriend the woman it had just finished despising struck her as more comic than offensive. But it taught her, past any forgetting, exactly what the good opinion of such people was worth, which was nothing at all. It was given to her rank, and would have been withheld from her merit, and a thing so cheaply transferred could not be of any value. She kept, ever after, a clear, unillusioned eye for the difference between the few who had been kind to her when she was nobody and the many who fawned on her when she was somebody, and she reserved her real regard, all her life, for the handful who had seen her worth before the world endorsed it, the Duke first among them, and his shrewd old mother, and the few true friends who had not needed a coronet to tell them what she was. And so Margaret Ashby, who had been laughed at as unclaimed at 30, became Duchess of Harcourt before the year was out. And the marriage proved one of those rare unions that justify all the trouble it cost to bring them about. They were deeply, quietly, lastingly happy. The Duke, who had armored his heart for 16 years, found in his wife the one thing all his rank had never bought him, a love freely given to the man and not the coronet, and Margaret, who had given her youth to others and thought her own turn would never come, found, at 30, that the turn had only been waiting, and that the years of patient, unrewarded goodness had been preparing her, all along, for a happiness deeper than any the bright, untried girls of 19 could have known. She made him a wife beyond his hopes, and he made her a husband beyond her wildest imagining, and the cold-guarded Duke learned, under the daily warmth of being truly loved, to be the open and affectionate man he had never let himself be, while the faded spinster bloomed late and gloriously into the most beloved duchess the county had known in living memory. Her brothers and sisters, grown and settled, gloried in her. The old dowager duchess took the entire credit, and was, for once, allowed it, and the Baroness Frayne, frozen out of the houses that mattered, had the long, bitter leisure to reflect on the folly of laughing at a better woman than herself. And if you have ever been counted out, my friend, ever been looked over and set aside, and quietly written off by a world too hurried or too foolish to see your worth, then I hope you will take this old story to your heart tonight and keep it there. For the world is forever doing what the Baroness Frayne did, measuring people by the cheap, quick standards of youth and fashion and circumstance, and giggling at those who do not measure up, and never once suspecting how blind its measuring is. It looked at Margaret Ashby and saw a faded spinster, finished at 30, and it was wrong. It saw nothing of the 10 years of unselfish love, the tested strength, the deep unbought worth that were the whole truth of her, because those things do not glitter, and the world has no eye for what does not glitter. But worth that is real does not vanish, because the foolish cannot see it. It waits. It keeps its own quiet value through all the long season of being overlooked, as a banked fire keeps its heat through the night, and it is there, undiminished, on the day the right eyes finally find it. Margaret's worth had been there all along. Through every year the world laughed, and when at last one man with the sense to see came looking, it was waiting for him, whole and bright and worth more than every fashionable glitter in the county put together. So do not let the gigglers tell you what you are worth. They told Margaret, and they were wrong by the width of the whole world. The clever, cruel voices that count you finished, that laugh at your plain gown or your single state or your quiet, unglittering life, know nothing of the real value of a soul, and their laughter, that seems so loud tonight, is the cheapest and most quickly forgotten thing there is. Keep your own worth whole, as Margaret kept hers. Bear the overlooking with what dignity you can, and remember, when the room is loud with laughter at your expense, that the carriage of the one who will see you truly may even now be on its way, turning, unseen by all the gigglers, toward your gate. So bank your fire now, and turn your lamp low, and let the quiet of the night settle round you. A foolish woman giggled that a good woman was unclaimed at 30, and all the while the carriage of the one man wise enough to see her worth stood waiting at the good woman's gate. They were married many years, the Duke and his Duchess, and grew old together in a love that the laughing world had thought impossible, and neither of them ever once regretted the long, lonely road that had brought them to it. Somewhere tonight, by some fire I shall never see, you have sat with a woman the world called faded and finished, and watched her prove that worth does not wither with a woman's bloom, and that the heart, however long overlooked, keeps its own true value against the day the right eyes find it. I should dearly love to know where in the world you are listening from. And I will leave you with this, which is the whole of the matter, that no one is ever truly unclaimed who has kept her own worth whole, that the world's laughter is the cheapest thing there is, and the slowest to be right, and that the carriage you have been waiting for, though it come late, and though the gigglers swear it will never come at all, may even now be turning, unseen, toward your gate. Sleep well. There will be another fire, and another story, when next the candles are lit.